He was a beloved music teacher known for impromptu dances in school hallways. But tonight, a Port Arthur ISD teacher is dead, and his wife's former lover is accused of killing him.
The shooting happened in a neighborhood off Beltway 8 in northeast Harris County yesterday morning when police say the couple went to pick up a child. But it ended in gunfire.
KTRK-TV in Houston sharing this report with KFDM. Maya Shea spoke with neighbors about the teacher tragedy.
Hey, what's good, Port Arthur?
In a Facebook post about voting, a bit of the lovable teddy bear personality of teacher Marlon Sanders shines through. The Port Arthur School District sharing that he was a beloved music teacher and football coach, but just after midnight Tuesday morning, Sanders was shot and killed here at Blue Timbers Court. Amber Howard saw the frantic moments.
I was just upstairs watching TV, and all I hear was a woman screaming, saying, "Gary, give me my baby, Gary, give me my baby." And then, of course, I'm still hearing it. And that's when I heard two gunshots. And right after that, that's when the woman was screaming, "You shot my husband, you shot my husband." I look out there, she doing CPR.
Gary Davis.
Harris County Sheriff's investigators say the Gary involved is Gary Davis, the former lover of Sanders' wife. Court records show the wife and Davis dated after she separated from Sanders. They had a baby 9 months ago, but then she reconciled with her husband. Records show the couple came to Davis's home to pick up the baby, but he was upset.
It's tragic, it is, because of the situation that happened. But we knew that gentleman there that lived there to have a lot of anger issues.
Investigators say Davis stormed out of the house and shot Sanders. The beloved music teacher and coach died at the end of the driveway. Neighbors can still remember the moment.
It sounded like firecrackers, but super, super loud. They sounded so close. It kind of had my ear ringing a bit. That's what it sounded like. It was just two shots.
Davis remains behind bars tonight. He has his first court hearing tomorrow.
There is a version of that night that should have been ordinary. A man and his wife through the dark streets of northeast Houston just after midnight. The city hums its quiet, indifferent hum. Streetlights bleed orange across wet asphalt. The radio might be low. Maybe they talk. Maybe they don't. Maybe she holds his hand across the center console the way couples do when they have finally found their way back to each other. After years of distance, after damage, after the slow, grinding work of putting something broken back together, they are going to pick up a baby. That is the entirety of the plan. Pick up a 9-month-old girl, bring her home, go to sleep. Marlon Sanders will never see the morning. By the time the sun rises over Port Arthur, Texas, one of the most beloved educators that community has ever produced will be lying in a hospital bed, pronounced dead. A man who spent over 7 years teaching children to find their voice through music. A man who coached young boys to become young men on football fields and basketball courts. A man whose students will one day say that he changed their lives will be gone. Shot down in a stranger's driveway in Harris County, 70 miles from the school where his students will arrive the next morning, not yet knowing that their teacher is never coming back. This is the story of Marlon Sanders, and it is a story about the violence that hides inside ordinary nights. To understand what happened on Blue Timbers Court, you first have to understand who Marlon Sanders was. Not the headline, not the crime scene, the man. Port Arthur, Texas sits in the southeastern corner of the state, a refinery town pressed against the Gulf Coast, the kind of place where everyone knows someone who works the overnight shift, and where community is not a concept but a lived, felt thing. It is a city that has produced legends. Janis Joplin was born there. Jimmy Johnson coached there. And it is a city where the people who choose to stay and serve carry a particular weight of belonging. Marlon Sanders chose to stay. He was 36 years old. He had been teaching in the Port Arthur Independent School District for more than 7 years, splitting his time between Adams Elementary School, where he taught music to children young enough to be discovering what sound could do to a feeling, and Memorial High School, where he served as an assistant football and baseball coach. He was the kind of educator who existed in multiple spaces at once, the kind who showed up to the games and the concerts and the bake sales, the kind whose name the parents knew, the kind whose absence from a hallway was immediately noticed. Beyond the classroom, Marlon Sanders was a musician. He sang, he DJ'd, he performed. He carried music with him everywhere he went, the way some people carry light. Port Arthur ISD would later call him a beloved figure, and that word, beloved, is one that institutions do not reach for lightly. It means something. It means that his presence was not just professional but personal, not just valued but felt. He had been married. He and his wife had gone through a separation, the kind of quiet fracture that happens in marriages under pressure, and during that time, his wife had entered into a relationship with another man, a man named Gary Davis. Davis was 38 years old and lived in the 12700 block of Blue Timbers Court in northeast Harris County, a residential neighborhood off C.E. King Parkway and East Little York Road. During the separation, Davis and Sanders' wife had a child together, a baby girl who was, at the time of the shooting, 9 months old. Then Sanders and his wife reconciled. That reconciliation is not a footnote. It is the entire architecture of what follows. Two people choosing each other again, choosing to rebuild something, choosing to fold a complicated new reality, a baby fathered by another man, into the fabric of their renewed life together. They decided to be civilized about it. They decided that the child deserved to know her biological father. They allowed Davis to spend time with his daughter. They brought the baby to him. They intended to pick the baby up. That decision, that act of grace, that attempt at coexistence, is what put Marlon Sanders on Blue Timbers Court. At midnight on May 26, 2026 days before the shooting, Sanders' wife had brought the infant girl to Gary Davis's home so he could spend time with her. A couple of days, according to the Harris County Sheriff's Office. A normal thing, on paper. A custody arrangement between adults trying to do right by a child. The kind of arrangement that happens thousands of times a day across this country, in parking lots and front porches and the neutral territory of gas station convenience stores. But something was already wrong. According to court documents filed in Harris County, Davis had begun sending text messages to Sanders' wife before they ever arrived to pick up the baby. The messages were not polite. They were not the communications of a man at peace with the situation. Davis told her in text that he was on that type of time. It is a phrase that means something specific in certain cultural registers. It means that the rules of ordinary behavior no longer apply, that whatever comes next is no longer bound by civility or consequence. He told her he was not going to give the baby back. Read that again. A man, with a gun in his house, told the mother of his child that he was not going to return the 9-month-old girl. What does a woman do with that information at 11:30 at night? What does she tell her husband? Do they turn around? Do they call the police? Do they reason that it is just words, that he is upset, that once they get there it will be fine, that they will pick up the baby and leave, and this will all blow over the way these things sometimes blow over? We do not know exactly what was said in that car on the drive to Blue Timbers Court. We know only that they drove there, that Marlon Sanders, 36 years old, music teacher, coach, husband, drove to a stranger's house in the middle of the night to pick up his wife's baby. They arrived sometime after midnight. What happened next has been reconstructed from court documents, witness accounts, and the official statement from Harris County Sheriff Ed Gonzalez. The account that emerges is precise and devastating. Sanders parked. He waited by the vehicle. This is a detail that matters. He did not approach the house, did not make himself a presence, did not confront or provoke. He waited by the car. His wife went to the door. Davis's mother came out of the house carrying the baby girl. The exchange was nearly complete. The child was in her mother's arms. They were almost done. Then Davis's voice came from inside. "Who you out there with?" His wife did not answer. According to court documents, she turned and began walking away with the baby. The rational move, the safe move. The move that should have ended the night right there, with a baby in her arms and her husband waiting by the car and the whole ordinary darkness of Houston spread around them, indifferent and infinite. Gary Davis came out of the house with a gun. He ran, not walked, ran toward Marlon Sanders, who was standing by his vehicle in the street, who had not spoken, who had not moved, who was simply there. A husband waiting for his wife and a baby in the middle of the night on a street that meant nothing to him. The shot or shots came quickly. Sanders went down. He collapsed near the end of the driveway, his wife with the baby in her arms, standing yards away. Neighbors heard the confrontation. They heard the chaos. And then they heard the gunfire that split the night open and changed everything. A 911 call came in just after midnight. Harris County Precinct 3 deputies responded and found Marlon Sanders in the roadway. He had a gunshot wound. Life-saving measures were taken at the scene. He was transported to the hospital, and there, in the clinical quiet of an emergency room somewhere in Houston, Marlon Sanders, 36 years old, music teacher, choir director, football coach, husband, community pillar, was pronounced dead. No one else was injured. The baby was fine. The baby, for whom this entire chain of events had been set in motion, was physically unharmed. But the man who had agreed to help raise her, the man who had driven 70 miles to bring her home, that man would never drive home again. Gary Davis was taken into custody. He was booked into the Harris County Jail. He was charged with murder. A motion was filed requesting that his bond be denied, and in Port Arthur, Texas, the phones started ringing. The news traveled the way terrible news travels in small cities, through texts and calls and Facebook messages, and the particular awful silence that falls over a community when it loses one of its own. Teachers woke up at 2 a.m. to messages that didn't make sense at first, that they had to read twice, that they sat with in the dark trying to absorb. Students who had no idea what had happened went to bed that night still living in a world where Mr. Sanders existed, where he would be there Monday, where music class was a real thing on a real schedule. Some of them would find out in the morning. Some of them would find out from each other in the hallways before any adult had a chance to say the right words. There are no right words. Port Arthur ISD issued a public statement. The language was careful and full of love. They called him a beloved Adams Elementary School music teacher. They called him Titans football and basketball coach. They called him singer, DJ, musician. They asked the public to share fond memories and words of comfort. They said their deepest and most sincere condolences were with the Sanders family. Sincere. That word means something too. But here is what keeps pulling at the edges of this story, what refuses to stay quiet when you look at the timeline closely. The text messages. The warning that came before they ever pulled into that driveway. Davis had told her in writing on a phone that he was not going to return the child. He had told her that he was on that type of time. That is not ambiguity. That is not venting. That is a man communicating in advance that the normal rules did not apply. And yet the system, the informal system of co-parenting, of good faith, of trying to do the right thing for a child, had no mechanism to stop what came next. There was no protection order on file. There was no official custody arrangement that would have triggered a welfare check. There was just a woman with a text message on her phone and a husband willing to drive through the night with her, and a man on Blue Timbers Court who had already decided what he was going to do. This is the part of the story that is hardest to sit with, not because it raises unanswerable questions about the justice system, though it does, but because it raises answerable ones. At what point does a threatening text message become enough? At what point does "I'm not giving back the baby" become a call to law enforcement, rather than a reason to drive there yourself? These are not blame questions. They are survival questions. They are the questions that Marlon Sanders, had he known the answer, I might still be alive. And there is something else. Something about the nature of the violence itself that deserves examination. Gary Davis did not shoot Marlon Sanders in the heat of an argument. He did not fire in the middle of a confrontation that escalated suddenly. By the time Davis came out of that house with a gun, Sanders had not said a word to him, had not approached him, had not threatened him. Sanders was standing by his car. He was waiting. Davis ran toward him. That trajectory, gun in hand, running toward a man who posed no threat, is not self-defense. It is not passion. It is something more deliberate, something more cold. Court documents describe it plainly. The defendant allegedly rushed out and shot the victim who was standing by his vehicle in the roadway. Rushed out. That is the phrase that carries the weight here. It carries rage and premeditation in equal measure. What was Davis feeling in those seconds? Rage at the reconciliation. Rage at the presence of the husband? A territorial fury at seeing the woman he had a child with standing in his driveway with another man? We cannot know what moved through Gary Davis in that moment. We know only what he did with it. He ran out of the house, he had a gun, and Marlon Sanders, who had driven 70 miles to pick up a baby in the middle of the night because that was the kind of man he was, the kind of man who showed up, the kind of man who tried, never had a chance to move. Let us slow down here and say something plainly. Marlon Sanders died because he tried to be decent. He died because he and his wife extended the kind of trust that this situation did not deserve. He died because the man on the other end of that trust had already decided, via text message, that civility was no longer operative. He died not because of anything he did, but because of everything he was, a man who showed up, in a culture that often celebrates the exit. The ghosting, the disappearing, the refusal of accountability. Marlon Sanders showed up. He showed up to school every morning. He showed up to games on Friday nights. He showed up to his marriage even after it broke, even after distance, even after everything. He showed up to drive to Houston at midnight to bring home a baby who was not biologically his, but who was his, because that is what it means to be a family. He showed up, and it killed him. The arrest came quickly. Gary Davis did not flee. He was taken into custody the same night, or perhaps the early morning, after the shooting. He was booked into the Harris County Jail. He was charged with murder in the first degree. Harris County Sheriff Ed Gonzalez confirmed the charge publicly on May 27, 2026, via a post from the official sheriff's office account. The deceased victim was identified as Marlon Sanders, age 36. The defendant was identified as Gary Davis, date of birth January 26, 1988. A motion was filed to deny bond entirely. As of available reporting, Davis remains in custody. Now comes the part that is hardest to write and perhaps hardest to hear, because this specific, terrible case, is not unusual. That is the revelation. Not the crime itself, which is horrific enough to stand alone. The revelation is that Marlon Sanders is not an aberration. He is a pattern. He is the latest name in a category of victims that forensic researchers and domestic violence advocates have been documenting for decades. The third-party victim. The person killed not because they were the primary target of a volatile relationship, but because they were adjacent to one. The new partner, the new husband, the person standing in the driveway. Research from the Violence Policy Center and numerous academic institutions has consistently found that the most dangerous period in any intimate partner conflict is the moment of transition, when one party has moved on, when the relationship has been definitively replaced. It is at this moment that the violence, if it comes, tends to be its most lethal. Gary Davis had not simply lost a girlfriend. He had been replaced. His child's mother had gone back to her husband. That husband was now standing in Davis's driveway, and the text messages, "I'm on that type of time," the refusal to give back the baby, suggest that Davis had been building toward this moment, or something like it, for longer than the night of May 26th. The baby girl was used as leverage. Read that sentence and let it land. A 9-month-old child was used as a hostage in an emotional standoff. She was the pretext for the confrontation, the reason Marlon and his wife drove to Blue Timbers Court. The thread that Davis could pull to bring them to his doorstep. And when they came, when they did the rational, trusting, good faith thing and came to pick her up, Davis was ready. This does not mean the outcome was inevitable. Outcomes are never inevitable until they happen. But it means that the system of informal trust that Marlon Sanders and his wife had extended to Gary Davis was, in retrospect, extended to someone who had already stopped operating in good faith. The text messages prove that. The threat to withhold the child proves that. Davis had stopped being a reasonable co-parenting partner, if he ever was one, before they ever left their house that night. Marlon Sanders was 36 years old. He had his whole career ahead of him. Students who were in 3rd grade when he started at Adams Elementary were now in middle school, and still talking about him, still carrying the seeds he planted in music rooms and on football fields. He was a singer who performed at events. He was a DJ who brought joy into spaces. He was a man whose very presence in a room, by all accounts, raised the temperature of the room, not in anger, but in warmth. He should have turned 40 in that same city. He should have watched his students graduate. He should have been there when the baby girl he helped to pick up learned to walk, learned to talk, learned to sing. He will not be there. And that is not an abstraction. That is a specific, permanent, irreversible loss of something the world needed. So why does this story matter? Not because it is rare. It matters precisely because it is not rare. Marlon Sanders' death matters because every community in this country has a Marlon Sanders. Someone whose contribution is woven so deeply into the fabric of daily life that it is only fully visible in the wound of its absence. Someone whose goodness was so consistent that it became invisible the way structural beams become invisible when a building stands. It is only when the building falls that you understand what was holding it up. Adams Elementary does not have its music teacher anymore. The children who needed him, who needed an adult who could look at them and see something, worth drawing out, something worth teaching, will need to find that somewhere else. And they will, eventually. But the specific version of that seeing that Marlon Sanders offered, his laugh, his energy, his way of making a third grader feel like their voice mattered, that version is gone. No successor creates it. No tribute restores it. His death also matters as a story about men. Specifically, about what certain kinds of masculinity do when they encounter loss of control. The narrative that Davis apparently operated within, one in which a woman's choice to return to her husband was experienced as a personal attack, a threat, something to be punished, is not an aberration. It is a pattern of thinking that is familiar across countless domestic violence cases, across decades of research, across the testimony of survivors who saw the warning signs and, for 100 different reasons, could not act on them in time. No one is blaming Sanders' wife. That must be said clearly. She was trying to do the right thing for everyone. For her daughter, for her husband, for the situation she found herself in. She was operating in good faith inside a framework that assumed the other party was also operating in good faith. That assumption was wrong, and she will carry that night with her for the rest of her life, not because she is guilty of anything, but because love involves risk, and sometimes risk extracts a price that no one agreed to pay. The price that night was Marlon Sanders. There is also something that must be said about the children. The students who walked into Adams Elementary on a Tuesday morning and found out, in whatever fractured way children find out terrible things, that Mr. Sanders was gone. Who had to hold that knowledge in bodies too small for it, in classrooms that still smelled like him, next to chairs where he used to sit. Those children experienced something that research tells us can last. Trauma that, unaddressed, reshapes the architecture of a developing brain, changes the way a person relates to safety and adults and trust for years to come. The ripple of what Gary Davis did on Blue Timbers Court did not end with Marlon Sanders. It moved outward. It is still moving. Port Arthur is grieving. The grief is not quiet. It is the kind that spills out of a community into public memory, into tribute videos, into school hallways where someone has taped up a photo and someone else has added a flower. It is the grief of a place that knows it has lost something it cannot replace, something that took years to grow. And it raises the question that every story like this eventually raises, of what we owe each other, not legally, not procedurally, but humanly. What do we owe the people who show up? What protection does decency deserve? How many Marlon Sanderses have to drive to the wrong house before we build systems? Formal ones, enforceable ones, ones with teeth that recognize threatening text messages as the early warning signs they are. We celebrate men who show up. We write songs about them and make movies and give speeches at graduations about the importance of presence, of commitment, of staying. But we have not yet built a world where showing up is safe, where grace is not a liability, where a man can drive to pick up a baby in the middle of the night and make it home. We have not built that world yet. Marlon Sanders believed we could. Every morning he walked into that school and taught children to use their voices. He was operating on the faith that the world could be better than it was. Every time he stayed late for practice, every time he showed up to a concert or a game or a family in need, he was investing in a future he believed in. He should have been alive to see it. If you know someone in a situation where custody exchanges feel dangerous, where threatening messages are being sent, where a co-parent has communicated something that made you pause, made your stomach drop, made you wonder whether safe is the right word for what's about to happen, do not normalize it. Do not push it down and hope it resolves. Contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233, available 24 hours a day. In emergencies, always call 911. If you want to support the Sanders family or the Port Arthur ISD community, reach out to the district directly through their official channels. The community has established memorial funds and tribute pages. Verify them before donating. And if this story did something to you, if it made you think about someone in your life, someone you've been meaning to check in on, someone you know is in a complicated situation, do not wait. Be the person who shows up. That's what Marlon Sanders was. Be that. Rest in power. Marlon Sanders. Port Arthur remembers, and so do we.